What's going on, Soul Tribe? I salute the divinity in you, and welcome to my channel, Alchemist. Justin here, and bringing another little nugget to add to the Soul Tribe archive. And in today's video, I'm going to be talking about Mars in Aquarius in the 11th house. And this is an interesting one, I think, for Mars to be in. I got some thoughts on that. Now, when we talk about Mars, Mars is known as the lesser malefic. So Mars can stir up some trouble sometimes, especially in day charts. That's where Mars is it's a bit harder to work with. Whereas in night charts, it's more easy to be constructive with the martial energy. But on a negative expression, Mars is kind of like very wrathful. It is the kind of like acts of aggression. There's this anger quality, frustration that comes with Mars. Imprisonment, captivity can be there, theft. There's this inflammatory energy. It's a hot cutting, separating, discord, that comes with Mars. War, violence. These are sort of the more shadow sides, misdirection, and kind of that sort of deceitful qualities. Those are going to be some of the more kind of things that Mars kind of covers there. So that's something that you want to keep in mind of. But on a constructive note, though, Mars can produce those who are, great leaders. I find that, I think of like the military officers and things like that. Those who bring order, who who are ready to take the call. Mars is those acts of courage. That in the face of fear, being able to move forward and face adversity and overcome those types of things. So it's not all bad with Mars, but there is those difficulties sometimes with Mars. So that's something to keep in mind of there. Now, when you talk about Aquarius, Aquarius is traditionally ruled by Saturn, and Aquarius is Aquarius is the fixed air sign, and they are active or yang in nature. Now, when you think about that and applies to Saturn, I first think of them as having a very disciplined mind. Like there's a strong patience. I think that where Saturn can be the boundary, the border, Aquarius has the mind to see outside of that. It gives them, I think, a very visionary mind. I think that Aquarius is one for me because that air is concentrated. So there for me, that if you can hold it in your head, you can hold it in your hand with Aquarius. It's going to be the thinkers. The innovators, thinking about how you can make this and take the old and improve on it. That's going to be, the Aquarius energy. So it's a very strong thing, I think, when you think about Aquarius. Now, when you get to the 11th house, it was known as the house of good spirits. So who doesn't love that? And this is going to be one of the succeeding houses. And some of the themes that the 11th house covers are going to be like friends, groups, alliances, and like your hopes for the future and things along those lines. So when you're working with this placement, a few things to consider. One, you would have an Aries rising by whole sign, and you're going to want to look to Saturn, because Saturn is going to be responsible or going to import the themes of this house and the themes of the 10th house, which deal with like your career, your reputation, any sort of like superiors, advancements, ambitions. And then Mars is going to rule your first house, which is your house of like your health, your life, body, and the beginning of all actions. And then your eighth house, which deals with like mortality, inheritances, the money and possessions of others, debts, loans, taxes, things like that. So one thing that I would kind of pay attention to on the more kind of less constructive side of this, maybe there have been challenges, or let's say more challenging aspect of Mars would maybe be in maybe like forming either like friendships, or maybe even having troubles getting involved in groups. On the extreme end, this could be even feeling like this sense of being ostracized, possibly. That eighth house deals with receiving from others, so maybe there wasn't feeling like there was that support. Maybe this was something that early on would happen, or at least this would be something I would explore, just kind of see how the friend groups look. And that's not to say that you can't make friends, but that would be something that would maybe would take a bit of effort there. This could be from, maybe that Mars brings in, that maybe a bit of aggression to the friends maybe that you meet, and that, I think Aquarius sometimes, it's like, when it's something is locked in as truth and as fact, then it takes a lot to change that opinion, again, with that fixed air. So maybe there were a lot of stubborn types maybe that were brought in, in the friend groups, and so maybe that was something where you're just like trying to meet somewhere in the middle, where maybe we can agree to disagree on things. Sometimes we don't have to always where someone has to be, right all the time. So yeah, but that would be something where I can maybe see some challenges there. I would be mindful with this placement. Mars can, like I said, Mars can be kind of like there's a shadiness with Mars. I don't think that's something that's talked about, where Mars can represent those who have experience with wrongdoings. So especially when we're talking about when we're getting to the money of others and and things like that, loans and stuff. Be mindful of who you roll with, and the things that they, the mentality behind that. I would just be very, very mindful of that, because that could get you where, because again, Mars can, lead to imprisonment, and things happen very quickly with Mars. So again, especially in a day chart, yeah, I'd just pay attention to that. Be mindful of who you borrow things from. I would take, mindful of, like, of course, like loan sharks, taking out like debts and things like that. Being smart about it. It's not that you can't, but just be mindful, because then if you accumulate a lot of debt, then that's going to impact your future and your hopes and dreams, because then you got this weighing down on you too. So that might be something that comes into the mix there. Maybe inheritance happens to come from, from friends. That would be more kind of, again, kind of like an extreme manifestation. Maybe there's something that happens, maybe like, again, Marshall, just like kind of like Marshall things, and considering that the eighth house deals with mortality, maybe there's something that comes with inheritances from, like, maybe like a friend, or sometimes even I think the 11th house could deal with like step parents. So that might be something where maybe that might come into the mix there. Or I would even say too, something, kind of constructive maybe to do with this Mars, I think, would be maybe working with other people's finances or maybe assets. Possibly that could be something that you could maybe find some kind of support in that. Maybe it's working for banks, loans, and that might even be something too. Maybe there was trouble with, like, finding banking things, and that might even be finding loans and things like that. That might be something where maybe there were challenges that were coming up with that as well. But those would be just some kind of some base things. And you know what? I would even pay attention to, the groups, because let's another constructive thing. I think that when you find those groups that are going to support the things that you want to begin, I think that this placement could, one, do very well as in leading groups. I could see that as something there, leading groups, and then getting that support for whatever the vision is. I think that Aries is, that being having an Aries rising, that is something that is very inspired. I think that there's an opportunity there, and it may be challenging at first to get people on board with maybe your view, but that's not to say hard isn't impossible. You know what I mean? So that might be something that may come up in the mix there. But I think that's all that I wanted to. Oh, you know what? Yeah, I think that. No, I think that's. Oh, you know what? Maybe even being involved in some sort of like medical group. Maybe that's something where you do something in the medical field. Just considering that the first house, that kind of life, body themes, and mortality things kind of come into the mix there. Maybe there's, and maybe the Mars is bringing in competition, because I would think, the medical field, from what I've heard from, I know quite a few people there, especially like what I've heard, like maybe nurse. I don't know if this is still the same now, but maybe there's like, competition there. That may be something, you're in a real competitive field, or maybe something that feels kind of high pressure. So that might even be like another thing, kind of manifestation of, kind of this placement there. But I think that's all. Oh no, I wanted to say finding those groups almost. I wanted to say finding those groups that do, look, when you find those groups that do support what you're doing, I think that there could be a lot of energy behind it when because I think that Mars in air sign, especially in fixed signs, having the friend sign in a fixed sign, I think that, or excuse me, like the house that represents friends in a fixed signs, there could be a lot of loyalty there as well. This could be where maybe you don't have like the biggest following. We're not bringing like Beyonce numbers, but you do have like your good following, and they do support you. We support each other. Like there's that reciprocity that's happening there. But that might even be something too, where just being mindful of how you just like if you're because the 11th house is not quite as public as the 10th house, but it is one that involves like benefactors, patrons, and things, kind of like your audience, those who support you, whether it be from like crowdsourcing and things from that. So I just be kind of mindful of that, because those sort of like rash actions sometimes could potentially lead to maybe cuts, with that martial energy and from support there. So that might even be some trickiness that maybe may even, ooh, see if I can talk, have something that you may need to navigate. So, all right, I think that's, with my words running out, I think that's all I have to say on that placement there. But if you have this placement or know someone who's working with this place, because you definitely need the whole chart to get a picture of this. But down in the comments section, let us know how this is manifested for you if you feel comfortable with that, because I think that helps give a good idea of how this can, the similarities and the differences, because then you consider all the other factors. So it's really, I think that's my intention, when making these videos. And if that's something that you want to explore more closely, whether it be your natal chart, or if there's some things that you want to elect, whether that's going on a vacation, planning a trip, or signing a contract, buying a home, whatever that might look like for you, down in the description box is a link to book a consultation with me. And if you have any questions about the services that I provide, I also have a link for my email, so definitely feel to reach out to me there. And also, there are a couple of links down in the description box. One is a link for the Celestial News. It's Celestial News Weekly. This is going to be the last week, I think, or last month that is going to be weekly, and I think I'm going to change that one to monthly. But there's a tab down there, and that just talks about where the sun and the other classical planets are transiting, what zodiac signs are going to be most affected, and how to most practically work with those energies. And then the other is the lunar shenanigans, and that covers the weekly astrology of the moon, what sign it's in, what phase it's in when it's going void of course, and just to get a feel of the energies as the moon is having its conversations with the other celestial bodies. So all that's down there for you in the description box. But until next time, stay mindful out there, keep raising that vibration through the roof, and I will catch you on the next one later.